Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Travis McGrath from Exago, here to bring you the third Exago support lab of this month. This is the third in a four-part series on our new 20.1 feature we call storage management. It's part of an overhaul to how reports are stored and retrieved. In our first two parts, we did a general overview. My colleague Emma did a great job showing how to migrate from previous versions of Exago to this new structure. So today we're going to focus on permissioning. Before we get started, and as always, if everyone is on mute, so if you can drop a hello, a yes, something in the questions panel on the right. Perfect. I see that y'all can hear me loud and clear, and that's great. I do have a couple of my colleagues answering questions in there. So if, as we present, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them. We always want these labs to be as interactive as possible. And if your question is, generic or appropriate for the group, one of my Emma or Tom will hop in and ask the question for the group. Even if it's just, hey, could you go back and repeat that? Or, could you give another example? Could you elaborate on something? Happy to do so. All right, so with that, I want to go into the overview of today's lab. And I do want to give a little bit of a warning. We're going to go into a little bit of SQL. We're going to talk about some database concepts because this is a database-driven feature. So we will show a little SQL, but nothing too technical. We're not going to be writing any code from scratch or doing anything too hard there. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about 5 topics here. So we're going to talk about how to identify a user, the sort of built-in system and how you can expand upon it, how to build access flags, what those access flags do, so how do you add content permissions if you want to create new ones, a feature we've added, a new feature in 20.1 as part of this overhaul called inheritance, and then we're going to bring it all together, do a little bit of a recap and point out a couple of key concepts there. All right, so before we dive in, just looking through the questions, mostly just hellos and yeses, so that's great. All right, so identity parameters. So in past versions of Exago, you would identify a user with something we called parameters, and you could pass in any number of parameters, but we always specified a user ID and a company ID. Now, those placeholders for values are still valid, but we have some explicitly defined identities. And these settings, out of the box, will have a class, company, and user identity. And we'll show this in just a second, you can add these, you can change them, you can adjust them as you want. But there's also going to be a key identity and owner ID, and this is one we don't recommend you change or modify, so except to say that you should always set a proper owner on through the API as a session starts, and we'll look at that in just a second. Okay, so these are coming from the database. So we actually have a snapshot of this database table. It's very small. And what you can see here is that these can also be stored in the config files. So you have an identity setting. In this case, we're adding a new one. So let's say class, company, and user were not sufficient for what we wanted to do. We want to break things down by department. So maybe our classes are things like the role, are you an administrator or an end user? But I want to break this down so the services team is different from the support team, is different from the marketing team, right? I want to have department level identifications. So in this case, we added this row. We can choose the priority of a identity. Of what we're calling a party. And we're using that word party the way a lawyer would use it, just to mean a level of group. So in this case, the department level. And we want the department level to be under the company, but above the user here. So an individual user might have permissions that supersede those of a department, but then the department will supersede the company and so on and so forth. And then from there, just giving it a name, that's how we're going to refer to it in the, giving it a parameter. This is how we're going to refer to it in the API as we set its value. And the description is really just a helper text here. So these parties are then going to funnel into our access records. And so our access flags are going to set for a piece of content, what permissions does a particular party have? So as a user launches a session, through the API, you're going to set all the identity values. That's going to define the different levels of parties that a user belongs to. And then those are going to be part of the access flags. So an access flag is a couple of things. So it's going to be a record in our database. We looked at this table, and I'll show it again here just momentarily. So our database has our content, our parties, and then where those things come together is the content access. So here we see for a piece of content, we can see what folder or parent it has, and then we see the type of party as well as the specific individual ID. So in this case, party type of 4 is a user, and this is basically just saying I, Travis, have this particular access record. Importantly though, there's an access flag, and this is what we care about because this is going to dictate what actual permissions we have in Exago. So here we'll go back and present. So the access flag it's a calculated number, it's a bit sum, but effectively it just means there are a number of different permissions bundled into a single number. And currently in 20.1, our first release, there are 3 key permissions that are implemented, but we've architected this in a way that we'll be adding additional permissions and behavior in the future. So there's a current state and some future enhancements that will be added to 20.1 to allow for some more fine-grained permissioning if you want to allow or disallow specific behavior. So to start with, can save. Can the user save a report? Can they edit a report? And can they view a report? Those are the current 3, and really the can edit is analogous to the roles that we had previously. So if you can edit a report, if you can't edit a report, then you'll see that lock icon that you're used to from roles in past versions of Exago. Okay, a great question came in about the identity. So before we actually go into the access flags, let me back up a second on these identity values. And the question came in that said, hey, through the API, we pass in the company ID and user ID to differentiate our clients. Will this have to be changed due to this process? And the answer is a little bit yes. There are, you will have to add additional API calls to set these values, but you should continue setting the parameter values of user ID and company ID. So you don't have to change the existing code, but you will have to insert a few extra API calls. We have a REST endpoint, which of course can be done as part of a single batch call, or through the .NET settings, we'll have an object that you can modify these particular values for. Okay, so on to the access flags. Yeah, so you may look at this, a great question came in and says, what if a user could edit but not save the values here? There are going to be some combinations of access flags that aren't going to make sense, so they're going to be ill-defined behavior there. So if you can't save it, we're not going to, it will supersede and not let you edit it. The can view permission is actually a really neat one. We're going to look at an example of this later, but this is a feature now because it'll allow you to have reports that can be used as drill downs or content to be displayed on a dashboard, but it won't allow the user to directly run those reports because they won't see them available in the main menu in Exago. Okay, so what's this image over here on the right? So this is a utility. So on our downloads page, I'll come back here, I'll go to our knowledge base. We have an article that explains what this utility is and links you to our downloads page where you can find it. But this is a desktop utility that you can run. You can connect it to your data source. So just like we saw the database that we saw in the overview, you can specify the content, the names of the tables, as well as, of course, your connection string. And then it'll read the content in the content access table, and it'll show you all of those, every piece of content. So here, I can see my reports folder, I can see the labs folder that we've created. And for each piece of content, you can click on it and it'll show you what access records exist. it'll show you all of the surrounding metadata that's stored in the database, and you can add additional access rights. So if I wanted to, insert or add new rights, this is what that utility is going to be able to accomplish for us. Okay, so in terms of access, currently keeping things simple, most of the time content is going to have one of two accesses. Either you're going to have full access, so you can edit, save, view, and in the future, full permissions around copying, deleting, downloading, all those things, or you're going to have read-only access. So that's just execute, duplicate, download, and view. Those are sort of your read-only examples. And these numbers, again, because this is a bit sum, they sort of total to a particular value. These numbers are representations of those same permissions, and this is how it's stored in the database. The nice part is you don't have to worry about how this number is calculated if you don't know how bit sums are used. Because we have this utility, you can click on it and see exactly what permissions a particular user has. Okay, so if you want to have a custom flag, again, we can use this permission to the utility to build these. So you see here this access flag. And in this case, it gives us some nice checkboxes. So we can just click the checkboxes to add those access flags here. As an example, you might want to set can hidden to hide something for a particular user or class of users. You could set can view to false, and that way they won't be able to directly execute those reports. They'll only be able to utilize them for linked reports and dashboards. A great question came in. So this slide, apologies, there may be a little confusion here. Some of the permissioning here in the future column says can download, can copy, can delete, can rename, and a question came in meaning, does that mean users can't do those things currently? And the answer is, of course, users can still download, copy, delete, rename content that they have permission to do so. If something's not read-only via the roles or via these flags. These are just going to be added as individual flags to modify the UI. So a user can still delete or download or duplicate a report currently. But as we implement these in a future release of 20.1, as in an interim build, we will implement them so that they can then impact the UI. So if you set these to false, then with that upgrade, they'll disable particular elements of the UI corresponding to what they are. So if you say a user can't copy a particular piece of content like a report, the duplicate option when a user clicks on a report will be disabled. Great. So do we have any other questions there on access flags? The other key concept, I guess I should just reiterate, looking at one other question here, is that one piece of content may have multiple access flags. And that's where the priorities here come in. So for example, let's see, these are a little hard to see the examples of because we have all these IDs, but you may have one piece of content that is available to everyone with a read-only access flag, and then one piece of content that's available to a particular user or maybe a class of administrators with full access and edit permissions, right? So in that case, you would have more than one access flag for a single piece of content. And that's where that party types priority comes in. So this priority column here, when you define a party type, you can say if a user has a permission, that permission record supersedes things with lower priority. Awesome. Okay, so moving on from the access flags, we might talk about how we set content permission. So using the utility and through SQL, we're going to show how this can be done. All right, so here's our scenario. So you're a system administrator, you have 3 canned reports in a folder that you've built, and you want the user to have access to them, but you want them to have read-only access. So what we can do first is look at the records that already exist. So as you create the reports, there are going to be records that are available in the database. Both when you create a report, there will be both the content record and of course the access that's saying, hey, whoever created this should have access to it. So here we have the SQL, and it's just doing a simple select. And so we're just saying get the name, the ID, the parent's folder name, and the type and the access flags from the content access joined to the content table. We're doing a little tricky thing here where we're joining twice in order to show you what folder a piece of content appears in. You don't have to do that if you don't care about the folder name here, but we wanted to show that in this example. So this query is going to pull up for everything within this folder. It's going to show you all those content and their corresponding access records. So this is just to see what we have to start with. And again, you'll notice over here the access records are full access is what this number means. So now we say, okay, that's fine. Admins have full access, but now we want to insert. We've identified, which reports and folders we want to insert additional records for. So here we're going to add new access flags, new records in the content access table. So we're going to say insert into content access, and we're going to give the ID of the reports in question. So these are the 3 reports we got from the last query, as well as the folder we want them to appear into. And then we're going to set the party types. So in this case, we're making them available to all users who can see reports. So the party type for everyone is 1. Because it's everyone, we don't need a party ID here because it's just everyone. And then we're going to set the access flag to 480. And what this does is this makes it read-only. So in this case, we're doing 3 inserts, and we're just inserting 3 sets of values here. So insert into the content access, the first report, second report, and the third report. And then we obviously can want to validate this. So the easy way to validate it is to come in either by changing these in the admin console, or setting, logging in as your user and setting those permissions via the API. But what we're going to do is we're going to change the identity. So when we're an admin, we come in and we see everything doesn't have lock icons. We can modify and edit them as we see fit. When we log in as an end user, we've changed the class to end user. We've changed the company, the user ID, and the owner ID. And you'll see now that when we come in those 3 reports, we see them, but they have lock icons. They're read-only like we are used to from previous versions of Exago. I want to pause there and see, are there any questions so far about this process of sort of doing it manually in the database here? Okay, great. Don't see any questions there. So then you might say, well, that's fine, but what if I want something a little bit easier? I don't necessarily want to have to modify the database for permissioning, each and every time. And absolutely makes sense. So with 20.1, there's a new feature that you can enable. It's enabled by default. You can choose to have it on or off depending on what behavior you'd like, but it's called inheritance. And the idea is that this will automatically add permissions as reports are saved and moved into folders. And so what we'll say here is that if you want to replicate the behavior from previous versions, whether using the file system or folder management, you would set inheritance to false. And what that's going to do is it's going to say when new reports are created, only a single access record is going to be created, and it's going to use the defaults from the admin console here. So it's going to use the party type and the default access permission. When inherit is true, then when a report is created, it's going to look into the folder that is something's being saved into, and it's going to copy all of those access records. So in this case, we can do something similar to what we did above, but we can use inheritance to do so. So in this case, we're going to look at a scenario. So we have our system admin again. They want a folder that reports appear on a dashboard. So they want their sort of invisible folder we talked about before. And we don't want the user to be able to run those reports. So in this case, what we can do is we have our user identity. We're logged in as the user. And before we build those reports, we can look at the folder we're going to save them into. So here, again, we're just using that simple select statement. We're saying we have a folder we've created called dashboard reports. In this case, it's a root folder, so it doesn't have any parent ID here. It's just all zeros. And we have full access flags. But what we want to do is we want this folder to use inheritance to pass permissions as we save things into it. So we're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to make one change to the content, and we're going to update the record on this content. So we're going to say for this folder, there's a column in the database called inherit flag, and we're going to set that to true. So here's the ID of that folder. And then we're going to insert a couple of additional permissions on that folder. So we're going to say for this folder at the root level, for admins, they get full access. And then we're also going to set the content access. We're going to set this to hidden, to read only. And this is going to be for so for the dashboard folder, what we're going to do is we're going to add an additional record here that says, the admin class has full access, but it's going to be read only and hidden visible as false for party type ID is 1. And so that's going to be for our end users here. And what that's going to do is when an admin goes and saves content into the dashboard, it's going to automatically create a record for both the admin so that they have full access, and because it's going to inherit from this folder, it's going to inherit the permission for the end user that it shouldn't be visible, and that will hide both the dashboard report and any content saved inside of it. So inheritance can allow you to set the permissions you want on a folder, and then as you save things into that folder, those permissions will be inherited or duplicated onto each piece of content saved into a folder. And so here we can see that not just with the fact that it's invisible in the front end, and again, we're using screenshots here just for the sake of time, but we can also write some quick SQL, again, using that same select statement, and we can look at content that's been saved into the dashboard reports folder, and we see that we now have 2 records here, one for the admins so that they have full access, and one for everyone else so that they have can run but not can view properties here. Okay, so what permission should I use? So then the last question here is, we've talked about how to identify parties, we've talked about the content access flags and inheritance. So how should you set these things if you're coming over from 19.2, or if you're thinking about how to, you want to create your user experience in terms of permissioning? So a couple of notes. So first off, if you just want to replicate behavior from past versions of Exago of 19.2 or a previous version. So in each case, there are 2 cases we're going to look at here, the file system or the cloud. You would set inherit to false. You would set the default party type to everyone, and then you would set access to full access. Doing this means that whenever you save a piece of content, it will default to having permission for everyone. So everyone will be able to see that piece of content, and then they'll all be able to edit or modify that piece of content. Of course, roles will still be in effect. So if you have roles that are implementing, restricting specific folders or making things read-only, those will still apply and take effect here. If you're using our out-of-the-box folder management example from past versions, this did something a little different than how the file system works. When a user saved a report, it only gave that individual user permission. So here, again, we would set inherit to false if we're just trying to match previous behavior, because this is a new feature. We would set the default party type to user. So when a new piece of content is created, only that user would have permission to see it. And then we would set the access flag to full access. So if you're just matching, if you're just porting over to from 19.2 and you just want to one-for-one match the previous behavior, these are the way you would set those settings. Okay, so we'll do a brief recap, and then I see there have been a number of questions in the questions chat, which is great. So identities are the settings that you use to identify your user. The really key pieces for identities are to that you can always customize them. So there are different levels of users that you can customize and to fit sort of how you distinguish different levels of users, that they have a hierarchy, so they're given a priority, and that they're set through the API. Really key piece, of course, is to always set the owner ID at a very minimum, although we'd recommend setting all of the identity values, and to keep using the user ID and company ID parameters that were used before. Once you have your parties, your identities defined, those funnel into the access flags. This is the content access table in the database, and the access flags determine what permission a particular user has here. So as you can see, the content permissions is the next content concept here. So for each different level of user, which permissions do you want them to have? And then do you want to use inheritance or not? So this is when something's saved into a folder, do you want to inherit the permissions of that folder? So for example, if you have a folder that's shared amongst a group of users and you can allow specific users to save things into that folder, and then those pieces of content saved there will then be available to other users who have permission on that folder. Of course, there are a number of recommended settings. We talked about them up above for if you're moving up from 19.2 and you just want to replicate the behavior. So I wrote CDocs here. Really, what I want to do is mention that this is a brief overview of permissioning, but we have an extensive set of documentations around the storage management feature, on the utility that I showed a moment ago, where to download it, how to use it. So I do want to recommend checking out the documentation here as well as this accompanying video. Awesome. Before we jump over to questions, I do just want to mention on Thursday, we're going to wrap up our 4-part series on storage management. My colleague Nick is going to show you a version of customizing storage management. So everything we've done here is using our out-of-the-box behavior to save things into a database. But if you have any reason for wanting to customize it, and there are a number of different reasons, he's going to show a really cool example of one customization. We're going to dive into some code. It's going to be a pretty neat lab we're excited for. Awesome. A number of questions came in, and I see some of them are being answered by my colleagues. So give me just one moment to read through them. And Emma or Tom, if either of you want to jump in with questions you think would be good for the group, feel free. A question came in that says, do roles always take precedent over access flags? How can this be changed? So yes, roles are always going to take precedent over access flags. If you don't want the roles to take over, what you could do is you could replicate the roles that you're building dynamically. You could either check for them and dynamically insert them into a database, or you could just build them into the database as a one-off operation, and then you wouldn't need to use the roles, and then you would have, only the content access permissions there. Great. A question came in that said, if you use roles, must we also use the content access table? Yes and no. So the content access table will always be used. You could, like we said in the recommended settings here, come up to, sorry, did I pass it? Yep, so in the recommended settings, if you didn't want to use the content access for anything, sophisticated, any layering of permissions. You just wanted to say, hey, there's a piece of content, everyone should have access to it, and then I'll handle everything through roles. You can do that, and that would be akin to using this file system cloud recommendation, where you would say, don't worry about inheritance, give everyone access to every piece of content, give them full access, and then I'll handle it through roles. Generally speaking, we'd probably recommend not doing that, or because we think some of these new features around inheritance and some of this more nuanced permissioning can be really beneficial. But if you wanted to do it that way, perfectly valid to do so, and you can continue using roles in that way. A couple of questions that were more expressions of joy about the can view feature. Awesome, glad to hear that that example is one you're excited about. I certainly can share that. I think it's going to be really neat, and particularly make a much cleaner end user experience where they can just have a list of dashboards. You don't have to have subfolders with lots of different reports or anything like that. Awesome. That looks like all the. Oh, the owner ID. This is a great question. Thank you for asking it. So I mentioned the owner ID a couple of times. I didn't dive deep on what it does. So let me just back up here. So the owner ID, great question here, is a specific value. And if you're very sharp, you may notice that in our table, we don't have an owner record in our definition of parties. This is distinct from the different identities, the parties that you can define and customize. There's always an owner ID. And the question is, where is it stored and what does it do? So the owner ID is a special identity setting. It's stored in the content table with a particular piece of content. So for each folder and each report, there's one owner. Though of course the owner doesn't have to be an individual user. It could be maybe a class, or everyone from a company might share joint ownership over a report. But the owner ID lets a user say, as the creator of a report, as the owner of a report, I always have access to it. So it will give them access to the report so long as they have access to the folder it resides into. It'll also allow for some sophistication around behavior with regard to deleting or moving things. So if an owner deletes a report, it'll be deleted for everyone. But this actually allows a non-owner of a report to delete it without deleting it for everyone. So if you have a report that's put into a shared folder and you're not the owner, you can delete it. It'll disappear from the shared folder for you. It'll create an additional access record for your individual user, saying you don't want to have access to this report, but other users who may still want to have access to it still can. So the owner ID is actually a really powerful concept. Great question there. Any other questions coming in? Awesome. So with that, let me just reiterate that we're really excited about this feature. We think it'll add a lot of capability, both now and with these updates, with the additional access flags being implemented, with future updates around some of the things we have bigger designs for. So I'll encourage everyone to check out the customization lab on Thursday, as well as to mention, we know this upgrading process that Emma walked through on last week is a bit distinct for our major upgrades or major releases. So if you have any specific questions, any questions about your personal environment as you're going through the upgrade process, please always feel free to reach out to the services@exago.com email, or submit a ticket on our support site, and we're happy to help and assist you there. So with that, I'll give one more second for final questions. Great. Just a couple of positive notes there. Thank you guys so much. And with that, happy reporting.